Mi nombre es Roberto Breña, soy profesor investigador del Colegio de México. Estamos aquí en la ciudad de Colchester, Inglaterra, en nombre de la revista 2010, El Mundo Atlántico y la Modernidad Iberoamericana, para entrevistar al profesor Brian Hamnett de la Universidad de Essex.
Put the themes that I've been broaching in several articles and chapters, many of which have been published over the past 10 or 12 years in Spanish, together in book form to see exactly where I had been going. And I hadn't done this before. To my great surprise, I found that I really hadn't written out exactly what I thought about this whole period. And what I mean by that is, by looking at it thematically and comparatively and trying to get an overview, or rather a view from above, to see exactly what was happening in terms of the issues and themes, and seeing where each of the different parts of the Spanish monarchy differed.
Okay, due to the Cadiz Constitution, the bicentennial frenzy, if I may call it, that we have lived during the last years in Latin America has moved now to Spain. What can we expect from the Cadiz commemorations? Which would be some of the caveats that you would mention to our readers before we reach March of 1812, when we will be at the peak of this new phase of historic, academic, and political remembrance?
I think Cadiz 1812 is hugely significant in the history of the entire Hispanic world and of those areas which were influenced by it, such as Portugal and the Italian states, and even in Russia in 1825 with the Decembrist movement, there was an attempt to establish a type of constitutional system on the basis of the Cadiz experiment. On the other hand, I don't think we have to get euphoric about the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. We have to be careful that we don't attribute too much to the influence of Cadiz, significant as it was, however. And I think we need to have a look at why it all went wrong in both Spanish history and Spanish American history. And this is not a lone historian saying this. Many commentators at the time pointed this out and were not listened to, blank or white, for instance. And many later writers, be they of history or of fiction, like Benito Pérez Galdós, also asked this question: what went wrong in 1810 to 14 and 1820 to 23? We need to keep our eyes on that too.
Since you wrote the book, The Politics of Counter-Revolution, you have been very critical of certain views of the Bourbon reforms that ascribe them too much weight to explain what happened in Spanish America from 1808 onwards. I would like to ask you about the relationship between these reforms and the independence movement in Spanish America. But before telling us something about this relationship, I would appreciate if you could touch on the impact of Enlightenment in Spain and in Spanish America, and if you could clarify for our readers the term enlightened despotism.
Yes. Well, all of this is immensely difficult. The relationship between the Bourbon reforms and independence is one difficult question, and the relation between the Enlightenment and independence is another. And they're, in a sense, they're separate but also connected. I think when we are talking about the Enlightenment, we are talking about many different and often contradictory aspects in Spain. And I think we have to get away from the idea that the Enlightenment was confined to the court and to the ministry. There were other groups who were enlightened as well, as any study of the Valencian Enlightenment, which was highly significant, will show. I think Enlightenment, when it comes to Spain, is a broad-ranged phenomenon which involves the modernization of education, reform of the church, reform of relations between church and state, but it seems to exclude reform of the relationship between monarch and people, or monarch and subjects, because enlightened doctrines or enlightened political ideas of rationalization and so on are used by the monarchy to strengthen absolutism rather than to move towards representation. Here we come into enlightened despotism. I've used the term enlightened absolutism several times, and I'm dubious about that in retrospect, and I'm even more dubious about the term enlightened despotism. However, I think we should see them not in the abstract as terms in themselves, but as relative to the period in which they were used. And I think the phrase enlightened despotism was mainly used by the opponents of reform to describe the whittling away, the diminution of their privileges, preeminences, and so on, by the state or by the monarchy. In other words, it comes out of the conflict between the old society of estates and corporations and the new society which we are looking forward to in the 19th century through liberalism.
And regarding the relationship between the reforms and the independence movements?
I think this is very difficult. I think there is no direct relationship that we can see between the reforms of, let's say, Charles III and early Charles IV with the independence movement. In that sense, I'm not arguing that the reforms provoke an independence movement. I don't think that's the right approach. I think if we look at enlightenment, which is a much more sensible approach, we can see the continuation of enlightened ideas, attitudes, and political forms into the independence period, through it and beyond, into, let's say, the first half of the 19th century. And that's where we can see the influence of, let's call it then, enlightened absolutism or reforming monarchy and so on, represented by the ministers of Ferdinand VI and Charles III in particular.
And insisting on the Bourbon reforms, what would be your overall assessment of these reforms from the point of view of the objectives of its metropolitan creators and developers?
Well, when we come to objectives, we have to be clear that there were defined and coherent objectives in the policies of the Spanish ministers at that time, and this is unclear because the reforms were often sporadic, they were often resisted at court and in the ministry itself, and frequently subverted or opposed outright in the Indies. So we're not talking about a coherent reform program. I think that really when we try to assess whether they were successful or not, we are dealing with too many black and whites. We can say yes, they were successful in raising royal revenues, but no, they weren't successful in binding the monarchy together because they provoked so much opposition. Or not sufficient opposition to bring the monarchy down, let me say, because that comes down for other causes rather than the contradictions inherent in the Bourbon reforms. Finally, there were groups who opposed the reforms outright. The Consulado of Cadiz, the Mercantile Guild of Monopoly Merchants, the merchants of Mexico City, the merchants of Lima opposed the reforms because they dented their privileges. They didn't see the need for them in any case, but that's another subject. But the reforms did benefit new groups of merchants in Guadalajara and Veracruz, for instance, or in Havana, Buenos Aires, and Caracas, Cartagena, where new consulados were formed at that time.
In your book on the Spanish politics in the revolutionary age, you give a lot of importance to the first Spanish liberalism, to its nature and its shortcomings. Before asking you about this topic, please develop what in my opinion is one of the central ideas of that book. That is, Spain's problems were beyond ideological differences. They were eminently financial problems. Do you still think the same way 25 years after you wrote the aforementioned book?
I think that, yes, I would reaffirm that Spain's problems transcended any particular ideologies which set about putting forward solutions for them. The problems which the Spanish liberals inherited in 1810 to 14 and 1820 to 23 were the products and consequences of policy failures and structural difficulties, structural problems inherent or cleavages inherent within Spanish society before the collapse of the absolute monarchy. It doesn't really matter whether it's absolute monarchy, liberalism, or Ferdinandian absolutism between 1814 and 20 that is in power. The problems remain the same or are even aggravated more. I think if we attribute the principal cause of the decline of the monarchy to finance, which I gave attention to in the first edition of La Política Española, I would say that even then, and certainly not now, I don't think this was the sole cause. It had primary significance, of course, but it did this because of other more deep-rooted problems. It's not just a question of financial breakdown, of course, because when we talk about financial breakdown, we're talking about the inability to manage debt. That's the essence of the problem. The Spanish government ultimately couldn't manage debt. It couldn't manage debt financing, and it couldn't finance war through debt. Now, if you compare this with the British government at the time, the British government was also in terrible financial difficulties, near collapse, etc., etc., throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, but it didn't collapse because it knew how to manage debt, or rather, it could manage debt, and the reason it could do that was because its economy was essentially strong, and although suffering difficulties under the war, blockade, etc., etc., Napoleon's continental system, the whole range of the economy, agriculture, commerce, banking and industry, had been through a period of expansion and would continue to do so afterwards because of their strong base. If we use the language which is now current, if we use the term fiscal military state, which originated in British historiography describing the British case, then I think Spain fails as a fiscal military state in the period from roughly 1796 to 1808. Now, reverting to previous questions concerning the continuity of problems, this is the essential one.
And regarding first Spanish liberalism, how would you see it now?
I think that it's important to look at the distinction between the Ilustrados, the enlightened ministers and so on of the previous century, and the liberals of the 19th century. Yes, there's continuity of policy and attitude between them, but there are differences of generation and differences of objective. And we can look at one of the issues here, and that's the issue of the relations between state and church as conceived by Ilustrados and by liberals. In the second edition of the book, I've brought the themes and the arguments up to date because there's something like a 15 or 16 year gap between the first and the second editions, maybe more, yes. And I needed to take on board the historiography that had been produced since that book was published in 1985. And in doing so, I paid more attention to regional questions than I had, although they were never absent in the first book. I saw, in rereading the book, the first edition several times, I saw the importance that I had placed on the opposition to liberalism, and I would reinforce that now and say that future researchers probably need to look at this much more closely, particularly in the period 1813 to 14, when the, let's call them traditionalists, gain a majority in the Cortes, but are not allowed to give political expression to that, because the liberals cling on to power both in Cadiz and Madrid.
In another book, you delved into the Mexican case, more concretely on what could be considered the social origins of its insurgency. In that book, you inscribe what happened from 1810 onwards in the Viceroyalty of New Spain within a long-term situation of social unrest during the colonial period. Please tell the readers of 2010 something about this aspect in particular and about this book in general, especially because this may be the only book of yours where social history is paramount. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that's a correct observation. Social history plays a very major role in this book, but it isn't a study of social history as such, because it has a political dimension which I think overrides the social content. That is explained by the fact that I'm not and never have been by nature a social historian, but in order to get the political answers that I wanted, I needed to develop more in the fields of economic and social history, and that the book came out of that. And the reason I wanted to do that was because the retrospective nationalist interpretations of independence movements, it doesn't matter which country we're dealing with, though this is especially the case in Mexico, didn't I feel give us the right dimension or the right understanding. We needed to know what exactly the middle sectors of leadership in the provinces and local communities were doing in this period. And I felt it necessary to take a regional and sub-regional perspective, and in some sense a comparative regional and sub-regional perspective in that book, which hadn't been at that time done before, though it's being done much more since, and with considerable success and amplitude.
In that same book, you mentioned that the 1810 insurrection was not a requisite of the independence, nor the basis of the development or evolution of the modern Mexican nation. Besides, you emphasized that independence did not bring along with it any significant social changes, something that on the other hand contributes to explain the social unrest of the post-independence period. Can you develop these ideas for us?
Yes. Obviously, the Hidalgo, Morelos, and Allende, Matamoros phases of the revolutionary movement were not in themselves successful at the time they broke out and were waged. The struggles were waged. In that sense, Hidalgo and Morelos did not become the George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams of New Spain. And for that reason, the shape of independence is quite different in Mexico from what it was in the United States, although ultimately both societies opted for federal forms of government. I mean, there's no evidence of federalism, for instance, in the original movements of Hidalgo, Allende, or even Morelos. I think also we need to take on board the strength of the opposition to them, or the spread of indifference to the rebellions. Communities, as Eric Van Jong has pointed out, and Juan Ortiz Escamilla, trying to hold their way between sides to not get involved, or being forced to one side and then another side, rejecting what they had done before, compromising with whichever happened to be the dominant group at the time. All of this obfuscates the struggle for independence a great deal. However, I don't think we should minimize 1810, and I don't think we should minimize the role of the let's call it the classic leadership, because the movement which they started led to a deeply entrenched insurgency which continued right through into the early 1820s and wore the royalist army into the ground. Neither side was actually defeated. In the early stages, of course, the pitched battle stages of Monte de las Cruces, Aculco, and Puente de Calderón, the rebellion was defeated on the field of battle by a professional army. But that didn't end the struggle. The struggle went on and was very deep in specific regions for very real social causes, some of which I was trying to analyze in Roots of Insurgency, Raíces de Insurgencia. This struggle is ongoing, and the Royalist Army, as Chris Archer has pointed out a number of times, never managed to deal the final blow. So the struggle still goes on into 1820. Now, Mexican independence comes out of that reality.
Coming back to a topic that we have already mentioned, you have been very critical of the position of the Cortes de Cádiz vis-a-vis Spanish America. Do you still think that the Cádiz Constitution would have been incapable of holding the Spanish Empire together? We are evidently in the very slippery road of counterfactual history, but considering the debate around this issue that has been going on during the last years, I am very interested in hearing what you have to say about this.
Well, this is a subject which is going to get a lot of airing in 2012, absolutely without question of doubt. It may seem that the constitutional experiment was unilaterally terminated by Ferdinand VII in May 1814, and that important as that termination was, we have to take on board the conservative or traditionalist opposition before 1814 in Spain and also in the Empire. But I think the two essential points we have to look at for 2012 are the fact that the Constitution of 1812 and the Cortes, be it of Cádiz or of Madrid in 1820 to 23, was not going to give any ground at all on three basic issues. Freedom of trade by American territories with the outside world, the equal representation of Americans to the number of peninsular deputies in whichever Cortes, Cádiz or Madrid, and third, any form of home rule, generally now called autonomy by historians, within the form of viceroyalties. No form of smaller Cortes in Mexico City, Lima, Santa Fe de Bogotá, Buenos Aires or whatever. Now these three basic points need to be emphasized very strongly because they do explain why it was that the Spanish constitutional experiment and the Cádiz Constitution in particular did not in the long run guarantee the survival of the Hispanic monarchy in its three continents.
In one of your articles, you mentioned that the most important political issue in the Hispanic world during the half a century that goes from 1760 to 1810 is political representation. Having in mind that modern political representation was almost completely absent in the Mundo Hispánico before 1810, please tell our readers in what sense representation was so important, and what kind of representation are we talking about here?
Yes, again, this is a difficult problem for us historians because of the lack of source materials on the discussion concerning representation and its nature before 1808. But undoubtedly there is discussion, but there doesn't appear to be any record of it, because mainly since there was no free press, or only with great difficulty did people speak publicly about their political ideas before 1808, there is undoubtedly subterranean discussion of this. This accounts for why it is that the cabildos of Mexico City and Lima, to take the two principal ones in the Hispanic American Empire, were frequently pressing for greater representation of Americans within the administrative organs in the Indies. That didn't come out of nowhere, and that didn't come out of a sudden shock at the nature of the Bourbon reforms. This must have been ongoing. When we look at the American majorities on audiencias in the Indies before 1770, this must have stimulated discussion amongst Americans and resident peninsular elites in the Indies concerning where this was going, what this implied, and would this be in a sense ratified, sanctioned by the metropolitan government itself. It turns out, of course, that from the 1770s onwards, the metropolitan government will go in the opposite direction and remove Americans and resident property-owning and married Spaniards from audiencias and other administrative organs. It's then, I think, that the discussion of representation begins to surface through the medium of the cabildos, the town councils. Now, the type of representation will be that which is reflected by the elites themselves, by the power groups in the provinces, and the corporate entities like the municipal councils, the Cabildo of Mexico City and Lima in particular. We're talking about corporative representation, a representation within the context of the Ancien Regime, the Antiguo Régimen in Spain and America. Now, when we move to 1808, when the absolute monarchy collapses, we open a different scenario entirely, because other forms of representation now become discussed in Spain, and they also are tentatively broached in the Indies, particularly in Mexico City, between July and September 1808, concerning an assembly. An assembly sounds like the French Revolution, though nobody is suggesting that a radical revolutionary assembly will replace absolute monarchy, but they do realize that the old corporative forms of representation are probably outdated and unworkable by the time we move into the 19th century. This is where we begin to see the discrete moves towards liberal types of representation according to population, which denies the privileged classes, the privileged bodies, the right to organize as, say, 3 estates in a representative assembly like the Cortes of the Middle Ages.
You have devoted a lot of attention to the development of liberalism not only in Mexico, but in Latin America in general. It seems to me that your position regarding this ideology contrasts with the one held by authors like John Tutino in the sense that it was an instrument in the hands of the elites to, among other things, for authors like Tutino, weaken rural communities. What do you think about this?
I don't like conspiracy theories of history of any description, and that certainly is one. It's not a view I hold myself, although retrospectively, when you look at the material consequences of a number of far-ranging liberal policies, it certainly looks as if you can construct that kind of an argument. But I think liberalism is far broader, and we've discussed the range of issues concerning representation, the structure of the new societies and their political institutions after independence, and in fact the whole problems of the Hispanic monarchy before independence, when it was one political space. And from there it should immediately be realized, it should be obvious that liberalism is responding to these problems. The problem of representation in former absolutist societies is an ongoing problem which occurs in the 20th and 21st centuries as well as the 19th. And liberalism was an attempt to respond to that with alternative organizations, alternative juridical and political structures. And it was an attempt to demolish the old regime, or to get rid of what of the old regime had survived. Therefore, it was against every form of corporative representation, which was regional as well as political. And it was in favor of constructing a system of equality before the law and representation according to population, not according to whether you're a member of the nobility or the clergy or whatever. Now, of course, within the context of colonial America, this immediately runs up against not only the problem of the corporate nature of the church, but above all, the corporate nature of the Indian population's institutions. The Repúblicas de Indios were corporate entities belonging to the old regime. And liberals, what 19th century liberals were attempting to do was to transform members of corporations into citizens and make everybody equal before the law. And they saw the demolition of community institutions as one way of liberating the Indian population from the corporate inheritance which belonged to the Spanish colonial era.
And regarding specifically Mexican liberalism, please give us an overview on how you see today its development during the 19th century. We know that you are an expert on Juárez, arguably the most important figure in Mexican political history. But this time I would ask you to emphasize other figures, other aspects, and other tensions of Mexican liberalism during the century.
One of the reasons why I became a Mexican historian rather than a historian of anywhere else in Latin America, fascinating as all the rest of Latin America is because of the wide range of interesting personalities that there were in this transition period from the old regime to the new, and right throughout the history of the 19th century. Well, this range of personalities who shared many characteristics and ranged over many disciplines. They were often writers as well as politicians, landowners, and so on and so forth, all at the same time. And they wrote on so many various political subjects and disagreed with each other, whether nuanced or confrontational, in such a way as to make it enormously interesting intellectually to study them. Mexican liberalism had the great fortune of producing a large number of these figures, and of course, not to mention the critics of liberalism like Lucas Alamán, for instance. But taking the generation of the Reform, and it is a generation, in which Juarez is but one figure, and in fact not the most intellectually distinguished or broad-ranging of those figures either. However, certainly the most politically adept, which is quite another matter. That's a dimension all of itself. But the other figures, Guillermo Prieto, for instance, have always interested me. Ignacio Ramirez, Ignacio Altamirano, Francisco Sarco. We can run through a wide range of literary and political figures.
You have also called the attention to the fact that in the middle of the 19th century, Colombian liberalism was in the vanguard of Latin American liberalism. Could you please tell our readers something about this?
Yes. Well, Colombians themselves often point out that Colombia was very different from the rest of Latin America because it didn't have as many caudillos or coups d'etats or military interventions, military politicians, as say Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, and so on, and the Rio de la Plata. Despite the fact that it was a curious composite nation in embryo, as it were, it still hung together after the separation of Venezuela and Ecuador in 1830. And it remained more or less civilian dominated. And out of this comes a civic liberalism, which is only partially tainted by militarism in the form of military caudillos like Tomás Cipriano Mosquera, who presides over one of the most advanced of the liberal regimes in the late 1840s, 1850s. In fact, David Bushnell, the US historian of Colombia of renown, is also fond of pointing out that Colombia came before Mexico in terms of the issue of the reform laws. It's an interesting phenomenon, that. I think liberalism was deeply rooted in Colombia, but of course, as in Mexico, there was a distinction between radicals and moderates, and when the radicals gained the upper hand in the 1850s and pushed for radical federalism, then there were real difficulties in holding even liberalism together, let alone the country itself. I think one of the main differences between Mexican liberalism and Colombian liberalism was that when Colombian liberalism lost power in the course of the 1870s, when Rafael Núñez shifted from liberalism towards conservatism, a two-party system began to emerge, which certainly was not the case in Mexico, where the Mexican liberals were absolutely determined, as their Gaditano progenitors were, that there should be no opposition party allowed to come to power which could subvert liberal institutions and policies. In Colombia, this happened in the 1880s, when the conservatives did come to power again and altered the constitution away from extreme federalism, restored the position of the church in education and in the whole state. Now, this was inconceivable in Mexico, in the Mexico of Juarez and Diaz, for instance. Liberalism and conservatism survive to the present day in Colombia as two of the main political divisions, perhaps for the reason of, perhaps the alternation explains this. However, as the last word on this, I think we should not always look at the top level of politics, but should look down at what happens on the ground in Colombia, because it was often said that when there were elections, violence always broke out at its most extreme, count the bodies, etc. So we are not talking about a pacific exchange of power, but often a violent one at the local level.
And let's say taking advantage of your knowledge of also European political realities during the 19th century, which would be some of the contrasts that you would find with what was happening or what was going on with liberalism in Europe, say during the second half of the 19th century?
Yes, I think there are many fields of comparison here. Mexico, Spain, Portugal, the Italian territories, Germany, in fact, and I think France, of course. And I think one way of linking them together, well, there are two ways of linking them together. The first is to look at church-state relations and at the role of the church in society and education, and the way the church saw itself as the exclusive, the Catholic Church as the exclusive representative of the Christian religion, and the guardian of morality through education and so on, and how this conflicts with the secularizing elements in liberalism. And this is replicated across Latin America and Europe. And I think the other way of approaching it is to look at peasant societies, or predominantly rural societies. You have, of course, in Latin America the complication of ethnicity, which is less the case in Western and Southern Europe. But here, liberals often seem to be isolated bodies with their support in the cities, but losing it or not gaining it at all in the countryside, partly for religious reasons, but partly also because the weight of the state created by liberalism is falling on the rural majority. In community terms, in tax terms, in military recruitment terms, and so on and so forth. And I think they're the points of comparison and discrepancy between Latin American instances of liberalism and European instances would be very rich indeed.
I go now into one of your articles that I find most interesting, that is Process and Pattern, a re-examination of the Ibero-American independence movements 1808-1826, published in 1997 in the Journal of Latin American Studies. In it, you mention some weak points of Guerra's work. You comment critically on the very much eulogized constitutional making process in Spanish America from 1811 to 1826. You talk about the volatility of popular participation during the Spanish American independence movements, and you refer to Creole patriotism. It is impossible to go into all of these issues, but I am interested in what you have to say about patriotismo criollo, and more specifically about its purported role during the independence period.
Yes. Well, I have to say that I've always been uneasy about this term, Creole patriotism. I think it has its uses, like the term autonomy does, and so on. It really originates with an American sense of belonging to the American continent and not being intruders, invaders, conquerors, and so on, which you would get, let's say, from the third generation or so onwards, say from the end of the 16th and well into the 17th, and clearly maturing in the 18th century. And the whole controversy that first Spanish and then Spanish American writers such as Clavijero in Mexico, in exile in Italy though, but retrospectively looking back on his time as a Jesuit in Mexico, they get involved in the controversy against other European writers, somehow disparaging the American experience and Americans in general. And I think there is a sense of identity and pride in an American, in the authenticity of the American experience as not being subsidiary to that of Europe, though not necessarily being opposed to Europe in a political sense. Where this takes us through the history of the independence period is very difficult. Because at least in Mexico at first, and then in Venezuela later, and Peru later on after 1814, we see the other ethnicities very much and directly involved in revolutionary or counter-revolutionary struggles as major participants. which in a sense pushes the Creole idea somewhat into the background. One might continue with the Creole theme into Mexican independence, but then Mexican independence is not made by a former royalist Creole Iturbide. It's also made by Guerrero and the former insurgents. There is no Mexican independence, no Plan of Iguala without Vicente Guerrero, for instance. Iturbide couldn't defeat him, so he did a deal with him. This is significant. So even in Mexico, the Creole patriotism element has to be taken with a pinch of salt. We have to modify it with a lot of attention to the post-insurgency and the ethnic dimension. I think in Venezuela, it's even clearer because you have the catastrophic demise of the first two Creole planter republics in 1812 and 1814. And when independence comes in Venezuela, it is true a Creole makes it in the form of Simón Bolívar, but he doesn't make it without the help of the other ethnicities.
Okay, and regarding the role that of Guerra's oeuvre regarding the present vision or perspective that we have of the Mundo Hispánico during this period, what would you have to say about that?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I mean, regarding Guerra's, because in this article you're critical of some points of Guerra's work, and I think that it's important to be critical about this work. But I also think that his oeuvre in general is very important, evidently, for
Guerra's work.
To study this period. Yes, Guerra's work.
I think Guerra's work is enormously innovative, very valuable, and we've all been influenced by it and greatly benefited from it. Where I would differ would be on I think two issues. Too much use of the term modernity, which I can't grasp. I've never been convinced by this. It seems to fall through my fingers every time I try to hold it. And the second is the attention given to the idea of public space. Now, I understand why this is done. It's an attempt to show that different social and political and intellectual movements are taking place, which are widening the sphere of consciousness, as it were, and broadening the number of participants in political discussion. Now, I feel that this sacrifices the element of conflict that there is in the transition from monarchical absolutism in the 18th century to the different republican separatist states in the 19th century. How are we to interpret the violence of the independence period? We can't push that into the background and say this was secondary or not important. It clearly was vitally important because it altered the nature of society. It's, you can't say that nothing changed at independence because there was no large-scale land reform or anything like that. All the social attitudes were changed because of the violence in the independence period, which lasted for going on 12 to 15 years in some cases. Social bonds which had held together in the 18th century were broken in the 19th because of the independence struggles.
What about, tell us something about the role of Guerra's work and your differences with him. Is that okay? Or
yes.
should I phrase it some other way?
Do you retain the first bit of that I gave?
Yeah, I think they can.
Yes, okay.
Just like go
right.
around, tell them.
Yes. I think a great deal did change at independence, and it changed as a result of the breaking of social bonds which had before that held together. Now, with regard to the concept of public space, that the expansion of public space, which he's got from Jürgen Habermas, you see, I think this obscures another issue, it's obviously designed to replace discussion of the impact of the Enlightenment and to move it from the history of ideas perspective to a sociological perspective. And in that sense, it succeeded really beyond its worth. But I think we need to get back to the idea of what impact the Enlightenment had, though not in terms of political ideas, but in terms of political positions and attitudes and stances.
In the same article that we are commenting, Process and Pattern, you mentioned something that I found particularly fertile to discuss the whole period, and I quote, "In many respects, separatism resulted less from a widespread commitment than from the slow erosion of any middle possibility." Could you elaborate on this, please?
Yes. I think we are not talking about a straight conflict between the Hispanic monarchy on the one hand and separatism on the other hand. There are many positions in between before we get to the position of no other recourse, which is separatism, which in a sense is forced on countries by what has happened. It's a de facto situation. By the time we get to the 1820s, there's no alternative. But in the 1800s and 10s, there are several other alternatives. There is constitutional representation within the monarchy, as offered by Cadiz, various modifications of the Cadiz system which might have been legislated. There is the possibility of home rule within the empire, and the possibility of restructuring the entire empire on the basis of 4 different corteses, which was muted in the Cortes of Madrid in 1820 to 23, a cortes in Mexico, Lima, and so on and so forth. These are middle positions, let's call them. And each of these in turn becomes unfeasible. I think, though, when we analyze this whole problem, we need to look at the decisive nature of Ferdinand VII's restoration of absolutism and the counter-revolutionary policies adopted in those 6 years between 1814 and 20.
Considering the experience you have in comparative history, I'm thinking mainly in your book on Mexico and Peru, I'm going to have a question about the appeal that the Atlantic approach has nowadays to study the Hispanic revolutionary cycle. I would ask you to comment on another citation that I extracted from Process and Pattern. You wrote, "The Ibero-American revolutions differed markedly from those of British North America and France in their origins and results." What do you have to say about the Atlantic approach to study the Spanish-American independence movements and about this citation in particular?
Yes, I think this is very important, and for that reason I've taken a chapter in this new book that I'm writing to discuss this issue, which I don't feel I've discussed before adequately, if at all. I think the original Atlantic idea came in the 1950s and so on, and probably came out of the Cold War situation in which the so-called West was portrayed as the representative of democracy and freedom, etc., etc. And so historians began to research how this was possible, what were the roots, and what were the great decisive moments which ensured this, differentiating Western Europe and North America from Central and Eastern Europe. And in all of this, you see, the Hispanic world got forgotten. The Iberian world entirely got forgotten, even though, if you like, the third, though not necessarily the third in importance, but the third in chronology, the third in importance of the great Atlantic revolutions was, of course, the Ibero-American. The collapse of absolutism in Spain and Portugal, and ultimately the secession of continental America from the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies. Now, the whole cultural history of this process is remarkably different from that of British North America because of the different political traditions of England and Great Britain from those of Spain and Portugal or of France. And that's why I said that they were qualitatively completely different. The three revolutions, which if you want to call them participants in the Atlantic revolutions, they were completely different in nature.
And regarding the other, let's say, of the four great Atlantic revolutions, we're missing here the Haitian Revolution. What would you have to tell us about this revolution vis-a-vis the other three?
Yes, in relation to the other two, I think the other two really, particularly the first of them, the British North American Revolution, a lot of the historiography has moved away from simply ideas and constitutional positions to look at commercial relations, Atlantic ports, and the Atlantic as a highway of commerce over which ideas and books come as well. To a certain extent, there is an element of this in the Ibero-American world, but I would say that we should look with equal persistence at hinterlands, because it's ultimately the hinterlands away from the ports, at least subsidiary to the ports at first, but important in their own rights geographically, economically and politically, and of course not forgetting the ethnic dimension. These hinterlands are ultimately going to determine the nature of the new republics in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
I don't want to put an end to this interview without making reference to the book of yours that just appeared. Its title is The Historical... It's about to appear. Maybe it will have appeared by the time this interview comes out.
Yes.
The title of this book is The Historical Novel in 19th Century Europe. And the subtitle is Representations of Reality in History and Fiction. Let's leave behind the history of the Mundo Hispánico, and please tell our readers whatever you feel like commenting upon regarding a book which main theme and subtitle seem to me to be so attractive in so many senses.
Well, let me interject very quickly. We can't get away from the Mundo Hispánico because there is a big chapter on the historical novel in Spain.
Yeah.
Yes, so we are not attempting to get away from it at all. I wanted to write this book because I felt that historians had not paid sufficient attention to the debate on the relationship between history, fiction and the historical novel. In fact, the debate has been between between the nature of history and fiction, and the historical novel hasn't in fact been included in this debate. Well, there were two things then. I wanted historians to participate in the debate concerning the relationship between fiction and history, and I wanted to bring the historical novel into this issue, which it hadn't been so far, curiously enough. Well, I was looking at the 19th century because this is the period of the mature historical novel, though I'm of course aware of antecedents earlier. I saw it as a European-wide phenomenon and certainly didn't want to look at individual countries uniquely, but I wanted to look at it thematically and comparatively and to see how authors had influenced each other in terms of how they approached the problem of writing historical fiction. But the book itself is not a history of historical fiction. That somebody else or a group of people could well write if they wanted to. It's about the dilemmas facing writers when they chose the historical novel, chose to set their novel in a historical period encountered, and their successes and failures, their difficulties. And so I chose as representative examples novels which illustrated this dilemma most of all. To take, for example, without elaborating on this too much, two novels generally regarded as failures by very great novelists who deliberately chose a historical theme at that particular moment to express the ideas that they had then. One was George Eliot in her novel Romola, and the other was Gustave Flaubert in his Carthaginian novel Salammbô. And I've gone to town on both of these novels, taking them apart to show what problems the writer had and why they had them. And essentially the book is about the tension between history and fiction within the historical novel.
And can you give me the name of some other authors or novels that you consider in your book?
Yes, obviously I've talked about the antecedents to Walter Scott and other novelists writing at the time. I've moved to France to look at Balzac and Les Chouans, which you'll be intrigued to know is a counter-revolutionary uprising in Brittany and Normandy in the 1790s, which suggests a great deal of roots of insurgency to me. When I was reading this novel, I was reminded that I'd written Roots of Insurgency dealing with Mexico. Because there seem to be many comparable points here, but then that's Balzac's novel, his only historical novel, although everything else he wrote is permeated with history. I then go on to talk briefly about Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, and then move on to Flaubert. And I moved to Alessandro Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, Los
Novios.
Yes, Los Novios, exactly. And I look at the Italian historical novel and move on to Germany and Russia and Spain, discovering, of course, by doing so, that historical novelists in these countries, beyond England and France, were particularly concerned with the theme of national identity. And the historical novel was often used as a medium for looking into a country's past to see what its true nature was and where it should be going in the 19th century. In a sense, it's the past through the eyes of the 19th century. So it reveals to us a great deal about the cultural history of the 19th century.
And which was the Spanish author or authors that you chose? The Spanish author that you chose was
Pérez Galdós.
And what novel in particular?
Well, the Episodios Nacionales. But what novel in particular? There are 46 of these. I took a selection of them from the first series, the second, and the third and the fourth, and one or two of the shorter fifth series. But I looked in particular at those novels, the Episodios Nacionales, which focused on major political crises, such as 1808 or the opening of the Cortes in 1810, or in the case of the second series, the Cien Mil Hijos de San Luis, the French intervention in Spain in 1823, the disamortization and the Carlist Wars, and the intervention in Morocco,
And well, I just can't finish this exchange regarding the historical novel without asking you your opinion or your view, your perspective on the historical novel that has been written in the 21st century.
Well, the historical novel, as I say in the last chapter of this book, is flourishing alive and well. Many are of immense quality. We only have to, if you take the contemporary period as, let's say, starting with the 1970s and coming through into the 2010s, that's 40 or 50 year period getting on for. We could start with Marguerite Yourcenar's L'œuvre noire, which seems to me an absolutely fundamental historical novel comparable to the great ones of the 19th century, but something very late 20th century. And other novelists have taken the problems of the historical novel, but of course without resolving them, this is very important to point out, into high quality award-winning novels in the present decade even. And of course the market for them at all levels far exceeds the attention given to the historical novel in either history or literature departments in any universities, which yet again are behind in their attention to what's really going on in society.
Yeah, but maybe, and this is the last question, but you've centered in those historical novels, let's say, of recognized quality. But I mean, a good part of the discussion regarding historical novel, I mean, in the 21st century, is because of the proliferation of this type of novels.
Yes.
What would you have to say about that?
There's nothing new in this at all, because they proliferated throughout the 19th century. In fact, there are many different levels, and each of these levels should have its own author, let's say. There's the historical romance, pure and simple, the historical adventure book, the historical costume drama, history as the background for all sorts of scenes which would gain popular attention, etc., etc. And one needs to write an essay, somebody needs to write an essay or even a book on why this phenomenon actually exists. If you go into many bookshops now, and it doesn't really matter which country you're in, just to give France, Spain and England as 3 examples, you'll see special sections on the historical novel.